Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to our pink Women's Shabbat. Why pink? First, it represents the organization Shalsheret that we are highlighting today, an organization that provides support to women dealing with ovarian and breast cancer. There's information that you can pick up in the lobby and all around. Pink is also a universal color representing love and compassion, something I'm sure we're all yearning for, especially in light of October 7th and International Holocaust Memorial Day 2 weeks ago. Originally, Women's Shabbat was going to be on International Holocaust Memorial Day, and so in honor of those events, I wanted to share a Holocaust-related journey I took this past summer with some women I love, about some women I love. Love is also a theme in today's Rosh Chodesh Haftarah, where Isaiah speaks of love of Jerusalem. Isaiah prophesies of a time of unity, a time that everyone will recognize the same God and help the Jewish people return to Jerusalem. Back in 1939, escaping Danzig and reaching Jerusalem was the only thing on my Safta Mansi's mind, because my Saba Max was one of those German Jews who had refused to believe that upstanding German citizens like themselves would be forced to leave the fatherland until Kristallnacht in November 1938, followed by the German annexation of Danzig 10 months later. Only then did he too come to that bitter realization that even proud German citizens were considered strangers, worthy of being slaughtered if they were Jews. But it was nearly too late. By September 1939, only 1,700 Jews were left in the Free City, which once boasted nearly 10,000 Jews. But somehow Mansi managed to secure a ticket out to Palestine. And in August 1940, the last group of 500 Danzig Jews, including Mansi, Max, and my 3-year-old mother, Batya, managed to leave. Left behind and never to be seen again were Mansi's parents, 5 sisters, their husbands, and their young children. Also in this group was a young woman named Rachel Becker. She had left her home in Poland some 5 years earlier to visit relatives in Danzig. While there, she was offered a certificate to immigrate to Palestine, and she jumped at that offer. She had not yet left when the tide of war swept in. That last group of Danzig Jews traveled by train to Bratislava, where they met up with other refugees from Prague and Vienna. On September 5th, 1940, 3,500 refugees left Bratislava on 4 ships bound for Tulcea, Romania. After a seemingly interminable wait of about a month in Tulcea, the refugees were transferred to 3 old ships, the Milos, the Pacific, and the Atlantic, for the voyage to Palestine. Mansi, Max, and Batya, as well as Rachel, were on the Atlantic. The harrowing voyage on these overcrowded illegal ships took 6 to 8 weeks. On the Atlantic, the captain and the sailors even abandoned the ship and threw its coal overboard. Yet, after the passengers dismantled and burned everything made of wood for fuel, somehow the ship made it to Palestine. In order to enforce the recently passed white paper limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine, the British decided to transfer the passengers of all 3 ships to a larger ship called the Patria for deportation. The passengers from the Milos and Pacific had already been transferred when the Atlantic arrived. Then, after about 100 of those Atlantic passengers had been transferred into the Patria, an explosion occurred. Apparently, the Haganah, having heard that the British were going to deport all the Patria passengers, attempted to prevent this with a small bomb intended just to disable the ship. Unfortunately, the bomb was bigger than intended, and 270 refugees drowned as the ship started sinking. The surviving passengers were transferred to shore and allowed to remain in Palestine. Those still aboard the Atlantic were kept separated at the Atlit detainee camp, and 2 weeks later, 1,580 Jews from the Atlantic were transferred to 2 Dutch ships and deported to the British colony on the island of Mauritius. This is a small island about 700 miles east of Madagascar on the Indian Ocean. They were given a warm welcome by the locals, but to their dismay, they were then taken to the Bobasan prison and separated from the population by brick and barbed wire. 63 years later, this past September, my sister Sharon, our stepmother Bina, were over in the visitors' lounge overlooking the still active Bobasan prison on the island of Mauritius. We saw the original brick building where the men were kept separated from their families, and the area where previously hot, flimsy metal barracks had been built for the women and children. We saw the high walls topped with barbed wire surrounding the prison, which we recognized from the photo we had of Mansi and Batya during their nearly 5 years they spent there. As we exited through the entrance gate, we could only imagine the grim realization of those detainees that 5 months of grueling travel landed them in a prison on a desolate tropical island and not the promised land. I'd always known of Mauritius. It had been kind of a mysterious place that was referred to often during my childhood. After all, my mother had lived there from age 3 to 8, and after arriving in Israel in 1945, the detainees kept up the friendships they had made there with annual reunions. Some were even lifelong neighbors. So when we found out that there was to be a reunion trip, we decided it was time to go and unlock some of the mysteries. Furthermore, our stepmother, Bina, was a Mauritius baby. During the voyage, her mother, Rachel Becker, had fallen in love with Itzik Zelikovic from the Czech group. After 3 years of imprisonment, the British relaxed the rules a bit and allowed conjugal visits between the couples. Rachel and Itzik were married, and Bina was among the 60 babies born during their imprisonment. 4 of those babies were on this trip with us, and as Mauritius babies, they were treated like royalty and were even wined and dined by the president of this small country. The reunion was the inspiration of Dr. Roni Mikel Arieli, a postdoctoral fellow at the Hebrew University. She had written a book based on her doctoral thesis called Remembering the Holocaust in a Racial State, Holocaust Memory in South Africa from Apartheid to Democracy. The South African Jewish community had been instrumental in supplying the Mauritius detainees with much-needed supplies, as well as newspapers, so they could find out what was happening in the world. During Roni's visit to South Africa, she was given boxes of archival material from the Jewish community. Included was a box labeled Mauritius. After leafing through, she realized that the Mauritius story, which she had never heard about growing up in Israel, was a project in itself. After finishing her thesis and her book tour, she set out to make the story known. As part of the project, she organized this reunion tour that we were on. In addition to visiting the Bobasan prison, we visited the San Martin Cemetery, where 127 of the detainees who did not survive are buried. Next to it is a small but lovely museum dedicated to this history. The Bobasan Jewish Detainees Memorial Museum and Information Center opened in 2014. We found photos with our 5-year-old mom in them. The museum had been cared for by the Island Hebrew Congregation established in 2006. Since there were no Jewish residents on Mauritius until recently, now there's even a Chabad, the Israel-related activities were previously conducted by the Mauritian Fellowship Club of Israel, run by the local Tamil people. This organization provided a voice for Israel and Mauritius and helped foster a relationship between the countries in science, agriculture, trade, and medicine. Like our family years ago, the locals welcomed us to their center for the concluding festivities and with food and smiles. We also had some time to be simply tourists on what is now a hot European tourist destination. But by far, the most amazing part was meeting other families where mysterious Mauritius was part of their family lexicon. And as such, we became an extended family, perhaps symbolically replacing the extended family we all had lost who didn't find an escape from the Nazi killing machine. Though certainly the detainees had to endure the harshness of prison life, inadequate food and clothing, tropical diseases, and not knowing what the future would bring, in retrospect, deportation to Mauritius was not the certain death back to Europe would have been. So here we were, survivors and descendants who had come together and formed a unique group. We are now constantly in touch through WhatsApp, and Sharon and I are known as the 2 sisters with 2 Mauritian mothers. Parashat Mishpatim that we read today offers us the most commandments than any other parashat. 23 positive, 30 negative, for a total of 53, or 11.5% of all the laws, all aimed at helping us create a just and fair society. The biggie, because we repeat it so many times in our liturgy, is to be pink, compassionate, and not oppress the stranger, because we were strangers in Egypt. And of course, all the Egypts we found ourselves in after that. Our intimate knowledge of the distress of slavery and the distress of not being accepted in the country you've ended up in should allow us to be empathetic to the plight of strangers. That is, those who are forced to live a life considered outside the norm by most, whether it be due to disease, poverty, intolerance, war, or slavery. Mauritius was an uninhabited island until the Dutch inhabited it and killed its trees and its dodo bird, infamous as the first known man-made extinction, around 1600. Then the French took over and brought slaves from Africa and Madagascar to work the sugar plantations they had set up. So many of the inhabitants are Creole and French-speaking. Then the British took over, abolished slavery, but brought in indentured servants from India to work the plantations. So many of the inhabitants are of Indian descent. The locals say they speak Creole, read French, and write English. The tiny island nation of immigrants descended from slaves gained independence from Britain in 1968 and is described as an African success story, one of the few African countries with a stable democracy. It does so by maintaining a blend of Indian, French, African, British, and even Chinese cultures and tradition so that everyone feels included. Now there's even a Jewish community of 100. I don't know if they'll celebrate the Jewish holidays, but the modern democracy of Mauritius is an example of what can be when people live and work together in an inclusive way. The kind of society that the laws given in Parashat Mishpatim can help us create, rosy pink. On the other hand, Bobasan prison reminds us of what happens when empathy is lost and people work against each other and destroy community relationships through hate and intolerance. On this Rosh Chodesh Adar Aleph, I hope we can find a way closer to Isaiah's pink prophecy, when all mankind shall come to a common understanding that God's laws of social justice can bind us together to create a just and fair society anywhere, Israel, Palestine, America, Mauritius, and that showing compassion to the stranger is what actually makes us great. Perhaps soon humanity can sing Isaiah's words together. Rejoice with Jerusalem and be glad for her, all you who love her. Sisu et Yerushalayim giluva, giluva kol ohavea, kol ohavea. Sisu et Yerushalayim giluva, giluva kol ohavea. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.